Hello, it's Phil Thatch. I hope you're having a great day, and today I'd like to talk to you just a little bit about a camera I've had now for a few months and I've been interested in having for 2 or 3 years. I'm a Nikon guy. I've been shooting Nikon cameras for about a decade, and right around the time I was thinking about buying my Nikon Z6, I also stumbled across somewhere on the internet some information about the Fujifilm X-T3, and I saw those knobs, those wonderful knobs on the top of it, and just fell in love with them. And I thought, man, that is so cool. And I almost bought the X-T3 instead of my Z6 when I bought that, whenever it was, late 17, early 18. But what kept me from doing it was two things. One, I'm a Nikon guy. I've got tons and tons of Nikon lenses, and the thought of switching to a mirrorless camera and being able to use all my old Nikon glass was definitely a selling point for the Nikon mirrorless camera that I bought. But also a point against this X-T3 is I learned about the XTRAN sensor, and I learned about how there's weird wormies that you see with this XTRAN sensor in the raw files. So that was kind of off-putting for me. Fast forward a couple years later, and a fellow who is a viewer of the channel, Mike Mitchum, he upgraded his X-T3 to an X-T4 and made me a really nice deal on the X-T3. So I went ahead and bought it, and I thought I'll just take a chance and see if these XTRAN raw files are a problem, because they're supposed to be a problem with Lightroom. There's a program called Capture One where they apparently look fine, but I don't want to change my workflow. I'm a subscriber of the Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop programs, and I've got no intention of trying to learn a new program. I got my workflow worked out just right for Lightroom. Guess what? I don't have any problem at all using the raw files out of this camera in Lightroom. I mean, sure, if I have to lift the shadows 5 stops or some sort of outrageous boost of exposure because I've missed my shot that bad in the field, sure, I see noise and the noise has the wormies in it. But you know what? If I had made that shot with a Nikon or a Canon or a Sony and I had to boost the exposure 5 stops, it's going to look crappy. It doesn't matter what system. It might look crappy in a slightly different way, but it's still going to look crappy. Exposure shot correctly in the first place, and the Fuji files are not a problem at all. So there's the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about. The next thing was those dials. I love the dials on this camera, but guess what? Don't really use them. I mean, I do use the aperture dial. I do. There's a spot for 2.8 and 3.5, and there's every single spot is accounted for. The ISO dial, I do use it. There's a spot, 160 is the lowest this camera goes other than some extended ones. And there's a click for every single ISO that this camera operates at, from 160 all the way to 12,800. And you can also put it on A, and then you're in automatic ISO mode, which if I'm not shooting full manual, then I'm probably in automatic ISO. I rarely, if ever, shoot a camera in aperture priority. I rarely, if ever, shoot a camera in shutter priority. If I want an automatic mode, which aperture priority and shutter priority are, I do manual aperture, so I can control my depth of field, manual shutter speed, and then automatic ISO. So I do use the dial for ISO. I do use the ring on the lens for aperture. If I was to want automatic aperture, I can just put it right on A. Rarely do that, like I mentioned. But this dial, the dial for shutter speed, it does not have a representation for everything. It has an 8,000 and a 4,000 and a 2,000. Oh, wait a minute, where's 2,500? It's got a 1,000. Wait a minute, where's 1/1600th? Where's 1/1250th? It's got a 500. Wait a minute, where's 1/800th? Where's 1/640th? Next thing down's 250. It's missing some shutter speeds. It's got a 1/125th. Let's take a look. Where's 1/100th? Where's 1/80th? Well, you can put it on one of those, and then you can move the command dial like you're on a traditional camera like a Nikon or or a Canon or a Sony, and you can, if you're on 1/125th, you can roll up to 1/200th, 1/160th, 1/125th, 1/100th, 1/80th, and then if you want to go slower, you got to move it manually down to 1/60th, and then you can control with the command dial. Well, what I found that I do, the more, and also the lowest speed on here, and I like this camera. I like this camera a lot for landscape photography. And in landscape photography, you use some really long shutter speeds. You use 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds, 30 seconds. The longest exposure on this wheel is 1 second. So what I've found you can do is just take this command dial and put it on T. And I lock the button on the top so you can't spin it. And then once this dial is locked in on T, then the rear command dial here will allow you to adjust your shutter speed. And it's just like operating a normal camera, like a DSLR or a normal mirrorless camera, not this retro stuff with the shutter speed up here. It operates like a normal camera. And, you know, this looks cool, but this way works better. And you can go all the way up to 1/8000th of a second, and every place in between, all the way down to 1 second. There's 1 second, which is the longest that's listed up here on the top, and then you can keep going longer. And you know, a lot of cameras will limit you, and the longest you can adjust on the camera without using a remote trigger is 30 seconds. Well, this one goes all the way to 30 seconds, and it keeps right on going, which I think is really cool. There's 2 minutes, 4 minutes, all the way to 15 minutes. So if you need a super long exposure, this camera can do it, which is really, really cool. And even though it's not using these this particular retro command dial on the top, to me it's still really cool. So that's something to think about. Now this other dial on the top is exposure compensation. It goes from 0 to +3 in 1/3 of a second increments, and then turning the other way, it goes 0 to -3 stops of exposure compensation in 1/3 of a stop increments. And I do use that dial. I use the ISO dial, I use that dial, I use the aperture dial. It's the shutter speed dial that I don't use. Now if you did, in the rare instance that you need more than 3 stops of exposure compensation, you can turn it all the way to the opposite side of 0, and there's a C. And if you've got things set up correctly in your menus, you can use the front command dial to do exposure compensation in 1/3 of a stop increments all the way to 5 stops, plus and minus. But rarely do I need that. I usually keep mine right on 0, but sometimes I might move it 1/3 or 2/3 or 1 stop in one direction or another for various kinds of photography. With that in mind, the fact that I prefer using this back dial to adjust shutter speed instead of this dial on the top, that new camera that Fuji's come out with that has kind of a more traditional design, I think it's called the X-S10, that camera might be good for me. It does have in-body image stabilization that the X-T3 doesn't, the X-T4 does. Same sensor as this camera, same sensor as the X-T4. That might be the right camera for me. It doesn't look as cool as this camera, but it might be functionally a really good camera for me. Now, one more thing I want to talk about, this is not a camera review, by the way. This is just kind of my thoughts on this camera after using it for a while. The other thing I want to talk about is ergonomics. This camera has a tiny and super crappy battery that lasts like nothing. It runs out really, really fast. I mean, all kidding aside, you know, I've heard people say 5 minutes and it's gone. Well, that's not true, but you can wear it out in an hour. If you go out and shoot for 3 or 4 hours, which is kind of my typical shooting morning, I'll be on my 3rd battery before I'm done. It's a good thing when I bought this from Mike, he included 6 batteries. The area where you hold on to it, and I'll put a picture on the screen, I don't feel like taking this off right now, is tiny. And when I'm walking around with this camera without this Smallrig L-Brackett, my hand gets to cramping because there's not a good place to hold on to it. But I bought this Smallrig L-Brackett that had a wooden extension in the gripping area, and it's fantastic. It feels great in my hand now. It went from this is terrible to this is fantastic just by adding this Smallrig L-Brackett. So if you're looking at an X-T3, I highly recommend picking up a Smallrig L-Brackett. They're really, really, really cool. And it's got a magnetic area right here, and there's this little tool. And with the tool, you can remove the L-Brackett and put it back on. You can also loosen this connector and move that over. If I'm doing video, I like to hold the camera like this so I can try to be more steady with it. And then you just close it back, tighten it with the tool, and put the little magnetic tool back on the bottom of the L-Brackett. So that's really fantastic. But all in all, I really like this camera. I like it for different reasons, I think, than I thought I was going to like it. It works really well. It does a great job. It focuses good. I don't think it's any better or any worse than my Nikons, but I just enjoy shooting with it. It's surprising to me that my favorite part is not the dials on the top anymore. Just some thoughts about the Fujifilm X-T3. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye.